everyone, David Eaton. Welcome to Church History Insights and Questions. The questions don't necessarily need to be about the church history subject that's covered in any particular podcast. You can ask any questions about anything that you wish to. Send them on an email to chiq1830@gmail.com. chiq1830@gmail.com. I have received a question in, or some questions in, and one or two about the word of wisdom. So I'm going to do a little bit of a insight on the word of wisdom tonight, and then get to those questions as they come up. So I want to take us back to a meeting that was held on Thursday, May the 5th, 1898. At 11 a.m. in the Salt Lake Temple. Present at the meeting were the First Presidency and the Quorum of the 12 Apostles. Let's see if I can bring up a picture to show you. And then if we have a look at a little bit more of this picture, we can see the names of the individuals involved. Seated in the middle of the First Presidency, you have Lorenzo Snow, George Buchanan, and Joseph F. Smith. Now, I photoshopped Wilford Woodruff in next to the head of Lorenzo Snow because Wilford Woodruff was actually the president when this meeting took place on May the 5th, 1898, but this photograph was taken later in the year, September 1898, and Wilford Woodruff had recently passed away, and Lorenzo Snow then took his place. But at the time of the meeting, Wilford Woodruff was the president of the church, and Lorenzo Snow was president of the Quorum of the 12 Apostles. Just a couple of interesting things about this picture. You will see that seated on the right is Abraham O. Woodruff, and this is the son of Wilford Woodruff. You'll notice that Wilford Woodruff and most of the other leaders of the church are wearing quite extensive facial hair, beards and moustaches. But you might also notice that Abraham Woodruff is clean-shaven. And this might suggest that sons don't always follow the example of their fathers in how they dress and how they look. And one wonders if all of the First Presidency and the Quorum of the 12 were clean-shaven, one wonders whether Abraham Woodruff would have be wearing a nice bushy beard. Interesting that this picture has 4 of the presidents of the church in it. We have the Photoshop of Wilford Woodruff, who actually has just very recently passed away. We have Lorenzo Snow seated in the center. Next to Lorenzo Snow is Joseph F. Smith, and then standing behind Lorenzo Snow is Heber J. Grant. So, although we only have one president at a time, we do have 4 presidents over time present in this meeting that took place on Thursday, the 5th of May, 1898. And what they talked about there was interesting. There were 3 subjects. One was Andrew Jensen's proposal. Andrew Jensen was the church historian at this time. Andrew Jensen's proposal to fund the building of a church historian's office. Secondly, 2 members of the Quorum of the 12 were asked to examine an appeal from a Nathan Tanner and to report back to the area to the first presidency. Not sure what the appeal was about. And then finally, they got into quite a lengthy discussion about the word of wisdom. And President Lorenzo Snow, who was then the president of the Council of the 12, having raised the question whether bishops were justified in refusing to give members of the church recommends to the temple because they did not observe the word of wisdom. He went on to say, well, he went on to read the revelation of the word of wisdom, and he drew special attention to that part which relates to the use of meats, which he considered just as strong as that which relates to the use of liquors and hot drinks. He also referred to the revelation which says that he that forbids the use of meat is not of God. And he went on to state that President John Taylor, who was deceased at this time, had expressed the view that some of the brethren talked too strongly against the drinking of tea and coffee. Brother Snow said he was convinced that the killing of animals when unnecessary was wrong and sinful, and that it was not right to neglect one part of the word of wisdom and be too strenuous in regard to other parts. Wilford Woodruff, who was then the president of the church, and he was the fourth president of the church, said that he looked upon the word of wisdom as a commandment and that all members should observe it, but for the present, no definite action should be taken except that the members should be taught to refrain from meat. Minutes of the meeting record that President Wilford Woodruff said he regarded the word of wisdom in its entirety as given of the Lord for the Latter-day Saints to observe, but he did not think that bishops should withhold recommends from persons who did not adhere to it strictly. So an interesting meeting, 1898, on a subject that had been raised many times before and would be raised many times in the future. And the author of this bit of information is a Thomas G. Alexander, professor of history at BYU. And comes from his work called Word of Wisdom from Principle to Requirement. And it talks about the development of the word of wisdom. The minutes of the meeting, okay, I think we already covered that. Sorry, I'm going to jump ahead. And Thomas Alexander says, quote, though it is clear that some church leaders like Heber J. Grant and Joseph F. Smith insisted upon complete abstinence from tea, coffee, liquor, and tobacco, all general authorities were not in agreement on all aspects of the word of wisdom. Later in 1900, after he had become president of the church, Lorenzo Snow again emphasized the centrality of not eating meat, a point rarely emphasized by others. And in 1901, John Henry Smith and Brigham Young Jr. of the 12 both thought that the church ought not to interdict beer, or at least not Danish beer. Other apostles like Anton H. Lund and Matthias F. Cowley also enjoyed Danish beer and currant wine. Charles W. Penrose occasionally served wine. Most vocal among general authorities in his opposition to the use of tea, coffee, alcohol, and tobacco was Heber J. Grant. He was the gentleman standing at the back. And he became the seventh president of the church in 1918 and served until 1945, a period of 27 years. And he would become one of the leaders of the state prohibition movement. He was particularly outraged at the church members who served liquor and at some of the 12 who opposed the prohibition of liquor at Saltaire. Saltaire? What is Saltaire? It was a recreation center, a place of holidaying. It was a building built on the shores of the Great Salt Lake. It had saloons in it, and many people would go there to relax and to enjoy the heat and the waters. He was also concerned with the indifference some of the general authorities demonstrated to the feelings of Protestant ministers who complained about the Saltaire saloon. During the administration of Joseph F. Smith, he was the 6th president of the church from 1901 to 1918. The first presidency in 12 substituted water for wine in the sacrament in their temple meetings. Apparently, this began on July the 5th, 1906. Prior to that, they had wine in the temple in the meeting between the first presidency and the 12. In March 1917, Frederick J. Pack of the University of Utah published an article in the Improvement Era dealing with the question, quote, should LDS drink Coca-Cola? His answer was no. His argument was not that the word of wisdom prohibited such drinks, but that such drinks contained the same drugs as tea and coffee. In 1921, under Heber J. Grant's administration, church leadership made adherence to the word of wisdom a requirement for admission to the temple. And that would have been the first time. But it suggests that it was static from that time onwards, and it wasn't really the case. There was still some movement. In 1928, General Handbook of Instructions to Guide Bishops and Stake Presidents on Church Policy reads, quote, it is important that all those who may desire to enter the temple for endowments or other ordinances should be encouraged by the bishopric to observe the principle of tithing, as well as other general principles. In 1930, Heber J. Grant warned bishops that young men using tobacco were not to be called on missions, suggesting that tobacco use was still prevalent. At the June 1830 MIA conference, President Grant particularly urged that girls not be allowed to smoke because, he said, it destroys the God-given power to bring forth sons and daughters into this world. The next edition of the handbook, published in 1933, reads that members desiring temple recommends should observe the law of tithing. The applicant should also observe all other principles of the gospel, should keep the word of wisdom, not to use profanity, should not join nor be a member of any secret oath-bound organization, and should sustain without reservation the general and local authorities of the church. What role, here's a question, what role did revelation play in the matter? It is clear that Section 89 of the Doctrine and Covenants was given as a revelation to Joseph Smith. Advice that the members of the church adhere to the word of wisdom was also undoubtedly given under inspiration. There is, however, no known contemporary evidence of which the author, Thomas Alexander, is aware that a separate new revelation changed the word of wisdom from a principle with promise to a commandment, necessary for full participation in the blessings of church membership. Thomas G. Alexander goes on that significant influences in the development of the word of wisdom, the nationwide temperance movement and the prohibition movement of the early 20th century. The temperance movement was early 19th century. It was 1826. The prohibition movement was early 20th century. These were linked to evangelical attitudes. Utahns in general and members of the church in particular were rather late additions to the prohibition movement rather than its early leaders. We mentioned wine being replaced with water in the First Presidency and 12 meetings in the temple. Over the course of the 19th century, wine was replaced with water in the sacrament throughout the church. And you'll be pleased to know that the communal sacrament cup, this is the passing of one cup around to everybody. The communal sacrament cup was discontinued beginning in 1911 for sanitary purposes, and it began to be replaced with tiny individual sacrament cups. These would probably have been metal in those days. Now, of course, we're used to the plastic ones that we receive every week. Just another sort of side comment on the sacrament. In 1946, concerned that the tradition of providing sermons and musical numbers simultaneous with the sacrament service was disruptive, the First Presidency instructed church members to observe a reverent meditative silence during the ordinance. So before 1946, we could have heard the music played, and we could have heard musical items, and we could have heard sermons during the passing of the sacrament. We've done the context thing. It's important to kind of understand the context of the times and the organization of the American Temperance Society in Boston in 1826. Members of the organization were encouraged to sign a temperance pledge, not to just moderate their alcohol intake, but to abstain altogether. A capital T was written next to the names of those who did so, and from this the word teetotaler was derived. Let's look at the problem, one of the problems with the original revelation. Bear in mind that this revelation was given through Joseph Smith the prophet at Kirtland, Ohio on February the 27th, 1833. As a consequence of the early brethren using tobacco in their meetings, the prophet was led to ponder upon the matter, reading from the preface of this Doctrine and Covenants section 89. Consequently, he inquired of the Lord concerning it. This revelation, known as the word of wisdom, was the result. Now, the matter was made more confusing by the way the revelation was first printed. When first issued as a broadsheet and later as a section in the 1835 Book of Commandments, these advisory phrases appeared as an introduction to the revelation. So the first three verses of section 89 were originally part of the introduction. These three verses read, quote, verse 1, a word of wisdom for the benefit of the council of high priests assembled in Kirtland and the church, and also the saints in Zion. That's a reference. Also, the saints in Zion, that means Missouri. Verse 2, to be sent greeting not by commandment or constraint, but by revelation and the word of wisdom, showing forth the order and will of God in the temporal salvation of all saints in the last days, given for a principle with promise, adapted to the capacity of the weak and the weakest of all saints who are or can be called saints. So it was not until 1876 that these phrases were printed in the body of the revelation, appearing from then on as Doctrine and Covenants 89, verses 1 to 3. As a result, during the Brigham Young era, the question was raised whether the advisory clauses were part of Joseph Smith's original revelation or whether they had been added as an editorial afterthought intended to soften the original wording. Well, Robert J. Woodford, historian, writer of the historical development of the Doctrine and Covenants, he says, quote, excuse me, unfortunately, the issue cannot be resolved. Although the earliest pre-publication manuscripts of the Word of Wisdom treat these verses as part of the original revelation, these documents were written months after the receipt of the Word of Wisdom. No document contemporaneous with Joseph's revelation appears to have survived. Close quote. Just to further cement the idea of how it was pretty confusing as to whether this was a commandment, this was advice, this was a principle with a promise, this was a requirement or not, is shown by two comments by the Smith brothers, by Joseph Smith and his brother Hiram Smith. Firstly, Hiram Smith, 1st of June, 1842, Volume 3, Number 15, Nauvoo, Illinois, Times and Seasons. Hiram Smith preaches a vigorous sermon on the word of wisdom to a crowd of more than 1,000 people. He started by stating, quote, that there were many of the commands of God that seem to be overlooked by this generation. He then proceeded to discuss all the benefits of living the word of wisdom. He equated the word of wisdom with the 10 commandments, and he concluded by saying, quote, let these things be adhered to. Let the saints be wise. Let us lay aside our folly and abide by the commandments of God. Close quote. So there you have Hiram Smith advocating very strongly for adherence to the word of wisdom, likening it to the commandments, inferring that it is a commandment. On the other hand, his brother, who was the president of the church, Joseph Smith, he declined to enforce a policy of abstinence. After one church elder preached a long sermon that enjoined the saints to sanctity, solemnity, and temperance in the extreme in the rigid sectarian style, Joseph reproved him for being, quote, pharisaical and hypocritical, and for not edifying the people, close quote. Later that evening, a church council concluded that a forced abstinence was not making us free, but we should be under bondage with a yoke upon our necks. The decision apparently reflected the Latter-day Saint ideals of personal conscience and forbearance, as well as the reality that an enforced compliance might tear the social fabric of the church. Now, moving on to Brigham Young's time, this is taken from work done by Ronald W. Walker and Paul H. Peterson, both professors of history. I'm going to kind of go through it fairly quickly. Bishops had exclusive rights to selling alcohol. Really? Church leaders tried to control drinking at winter quarters. Remember, winter quarters was this sort of staging off post in what's now Omaha, Nebraska. And it was a pretty desperate time. A lot of sickness, a lot of death. Very difficult time. And alcohol was used quite extensively to assist the saints in those extremely dire circumstances. Church leaders tried to control drinking at winter quarters by giving the bishops exclusive right to sell alcohol. Illegal vendors nevertheless sold enough drink to cause very prevalent drunkenness and disorderly noise, close quote. Brigham liked to chew tobacco. It was not, this is a quote from Brigham Young, excuse me. Quote, "If I was not afflicted with chewing tobacco," he told the saints, "I should be just right with the word of wisdom." General Church Minutes, March 21st, 1847. He was very concerned about the money spent on tea, coffee, and tobacco. In 1851, the same year that President Young had been appointed governor of the territory of Utah, he expressed his regret that the pioneers had spent an estimated $50,000 on tea, coffee, and tobacco. In his mind, a misuse of resources and a negation of the word of wisdom's promise of temporal and monetary blessings. Brigham Young, again, apparently the move to close Salt Lake City's distilleries proved ineffectual or troubling, and Brigham himself eventually established what he later described as one of the best stills in the territory. Perhaps to better control the manufacture and sale of a product that Brigham continued to believe had some limited virtue. Quote, he said, "I never permitted any alcohol to be made only for the use and benefit of the people. If I keep a bottle containing spirits to mix with a little camphor and wash my body," interestingly enough, whiskey was used a lot for the cleaning of the body, "or to administer any of my family that may be sick, I am not obliged to drink it. Neither are you. It is good for the washing of the body and for the medicine to apply in many cases of sickness and in health." 1852, Brigham is alarmed by what he calls swill tubs, cursing and staggering. In 1852, he complained that some men were making perfect swill tubs of themselves, cursing and swearing in the city's beer shops, and walking unsteadily in the streets. Brigham accused some, quote, "elders of Israel, men who had done much good and who were firm in the faith, of descending to the poor, miserable state of a drunkard." He said, quote, "You meet them in the streets so drunk they do not know where they are," said the church leader. "Yet they say they believe Mormonism with all their hearts." By early spring 1855, liquor was apparently relatively difficult to come by. This is a quote from Salt Lake City Bishop Edward D. Woolley, who I think was a forebear of Spencer W. Kimball. He said, quote, "I like it a little myself, but can't get it. We can't have beer or whiskey to drink because of the devilish saints who don't know how to use it." The ideal that most Mormons continue to uphold was the moderate or rational use of alcohol, if only other members of the church could be wise in their conduct. This was also observed by outsiders. 1855, there was a visit by Jules Rimet, a French naturalist and traveler. He was traveling with Julius Brenchley. Jules Rimet, incidentally, ought not to be confused with Jules Rimet, the man behind the Football World Cup. But they noted on their visit that moderate use, not abstinence, was the ideal. Or, quote, "although there are neither grog shops nor dealers in any kind of drinks to be met with," wrote Remy, "it does not necessarily follow that the saints refrain from the moderate use of spirituous or fermented liquors. No command compels them to reject certain productions of nature or of art." Brigham Young, these are comments that he made in the Salt Lake Tabernacle on April the 7th, 1861. Quote, Some of the brethren are very strenuous upon the word of wisdom and would like to have me preach upon it and urge it upon the brethren and make it a test of fellowship. I do not think that I shall do so. I have never done so. We annually expend only $60,000 to break the word of wisdom, and we can save the money and still break it, if we will break it. Some would ask Brother Brigham whether he keeps the word of wisdom. No, and I can say still further, as I told one of the teachers in Nauvoo, I come as near doing so as any man in this generation, close quote. Brigham is implying that moderate use of alcohol, tea, coffee, and tobacco was fairly prevalent in those days. It should be said, though, that Brigham, in his utterances, did move from one position to another. At times, he did encourage abstinence, and at other times, he appears to advocate moderation, use in moderation. In 1865, Brigham makes an interesting statement in a general conference, I think this is in. He says, quote, "There is more grumbling in Deseret, Utah, for tobacco than there is for bread." He said that in 1863. In 1865, he told a congregation that the saints must adhere to the health revelation if they expected to return to Jackson County, Missouri for the millennial gathering. And there's a quote here. It says, this was made by the recorder, so impressive were his remarks that there was quite a rustling afterwards among loose dried tobacco leaves, various remnants of plugs being consigned to other places than pockets of masticatory organs, and numerous resolves were made that tea and coffee would be henceforth abstained from, and the word of wisdom strictly observed. Close quote. It's interesting, the comment by Brigham Young about returning to Jackson County, Missouri. We must remember that the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints is a millennial church. It is now, and it always has been from the beginning, probably more so from the beginning than now. We still look forward, or members of the church look forward to the return of the Savior and the millennial reign. But in the 1850s and 1860s, when these quotes were being made, there was huge expectation that the return of the Savior, the second coming of the Savior, was very imminent, and that when it came, part of the millennial reign would sweep the people out of Missouri who had treated the church members so badly, and that the church would then be able to return to Zion, to Jackson County, Missouri. We need to keep that in mind. We mustn't underestimate how much that those thoughts impinged upon all of the thinking and all of the decision making that church leaders make. In 1869, Brigham Young says, "I require all under 100 years old to stop using tobacco and drinking whiskey." He went on to say, quote, "If they do not, we will soon make it a test of fellowship in the church." And he also warned that those saints participating in the millennium would be observers of the health code. Another reference to the millennium. When we hear the word millennium in our days, we tend to think that, well, that could be any time, it could be sometime, most likely sometime in the future. When they heard the word millennium in 1850, 1860, 1870, and so forth, they believed that this was very, very imminent. In May 1870, President Young reproached men who spit tobacco quids on the tabernacle floor. Quote, It is an imposition for gentlemen to spit tobacco juice around or to leave their quids of tobacco on the floor, he said. He wanted no more tobacco chewing in conference. 1871, Elder Orson Pratt, then a member of the Quorum of the 12 Apostles, was not exaggerating when, at a School of Prophets meeting in Salt Lake City, he talked about the great lack of observance of the word of wisdom by the saints. So during Brigham Young's administration, it's true to say that church members did not say a great deal about the change in the word of wisdom attitudes. However, from present-day hindsight, it is clear that during Brigham's years, a modification did occur. When the Brigham Young administration began, the saints strived to obey the health code by being moderate users of its prescribed substances and by avoiding public drunkenness. At Brigham's death, 1877, the people understood that the ideal was abstinence. So that information comes from Ronald Walker and Paul Peterson's book, Brigham Young's Word of Wisdom. Now, one of the questions I got in was from Jack, who asks, what was the last beverage Joseph Smith is known to have consumed before his death? Well, the answer, of course, to that is it was wine. Both John Taylor and Willard Richards, in their notes and their accounts of the martyrdom of Joseph and Hiram Smith, they both record that wine was asked for and was brought into Carthage jail. John Taylor says, quote, our spirits were generally dull and heavy, and it was sent for to revive us. And other questions have come in about the extent to which Joseph Smith lived the word of wisdom. And it is evident from the documentary record, sparse though it is, that there were occasions that Joseph Smith took wine, beer, and whiskey. Was Joseph Smith a drunkard? He was accused of being a drunkard on one occasion. The accusation was that he and his father became drunk. The admission from Joseph and his father was that they had been drinking beer and that they were merry, but they weren't drunk. And the conclusion from most historians who look at the subject and who have spent their lives researching through the documents are that, yes, Joseph Smith partook of alcohol, but he wasn't regarded as a drunkard, and he wasn't addicted. In their opinion, he wasn't addicted to any of the alcohol that he consumed. And what is apparent is that although the word of wisdom was given in 1833, many people continued to drink alcohol in moderation, being careful not to get drunk. Many people continue to consume tea and coffee. Many people continue to consume tobacco, mostly by chewing rather than smoking, although the record accounts for smoking too. So as we in the 21st century look back to the 19th century, we mustn't do it through our presentism eyes, and we mustn't draw conclusions based on what we do today. And we need to look at the context. And alcohol was consumed very considerably in the 19th century by all Americans. One account that I read said that the average or typical American family, including the children, would consume alcohol for breakfast, for lunch, and for dinner. And that was the social norms of the day. They're a little different to those of our day. If you have a question of any kind, not just about the word of wisdom, but on any subject, drop it on an email to me. The email address is chiq1830@gmail.com. So that's chiq1830@gmail.com. And I'll be very pleased to have a look at it and bring it up in discussion. Thanks for your time. Good being with you. Talk to you soon. Bye-bye.